Shalom, shalom. You're listening to Live Internet Studies. This is episode number 217. My name is Ariel ben-Lyman HaNaviy. Let's open with a quick word of prayer. Avinu Malkeinu, our Father, our King, Lord, as we count our way from Passover to Pentecost, which represents basically the connection from the season of being set free by the blood of Yeshua to the season of being filled by the Spirit of Yeshua, we anticipate what is around the corner. We thank you that you are drawing us into this relationship with you via the mechanism of the festivals and the special holy days as we're counting the Omer and reminding ourselves that you have given these to us for our benefit, even though the finished work on the cross that Messiah accomplished for us is just that. It's a finished work. There's nothing we can do to add to it. Nevertheless, because of the ongoing path of sanctification and the way that you have commanded us to continue to press in to matters of holiness, well, then we regard this journey of holiness as something that is very, very beneficial and something that is going to bless us in so many ways. So thank you for this opportunity that is afforded to us as a body, as individuals. Continue to strengthen us along this journey and help us to see Messiah at every turn, for indeed he is the preeminent one. He is the reason why we do the things that we do, why we walk out the Bible the way we do, why we allow ourselves to be immersed in this particular Hebraic lifestyle. So be with those who want to join the study, but for whatever reason weren't able to. I pray to bless those who join the study after the fact via YouTube video or iTunes podcasts or whatnot. Continue to strengthen us, Lord, and protect us and give us a voice of sanity in this otherwise absolutely upside down, insane world that we live in. Help us to continue to have that blessed hope as we look forward to the soon return of our Messiah, Yeshua, and we'll continue to give the praise and glory of Hashem Yeshua. Amen. Okay, everyone, my name is Ariel ben-Lyman HaNaviy, and this is a study. This is a study entitled Eschatology, a biblical study of end-time events, and we're looking at the 70th week of Daniel. Specifically, we're turning to the final 7 years of this intense time that is described by the Bible, not just Daniel, but described by the Bible as a time period when mankind's regimes and the what we might call the rebellion of mankind comes to a head, and God allows this to happen by bringing in key players into the world events. Particularly, we want to be looking at Antichrist right around the corner, and how is this going to affect not just everyone in the world, right? We understand Antichrist is something that is, or a figure that's going to have his influence worldwide, but particularly, how is it going to affect Israel, the people of Israel, and the land of Israel, and the religion of Israel? And so that's kind of where we're going in our Bible study right now. As you can see, give me a second, I'm going to switch to a different slide for a second. As you can see on my screen, there is a topical index to the study that we're working through. Right now, I've got 17 topics that you can see on my screen right now, and we've worked our way from topic 1 through topic 4. We're currently on topic 5, Book of Daniel, the 70 weeks of Daniel. And I'm excited about the topic that follows next, which is topic 6, Excursus, Antichrist, according to Robert Van Kampen. Robert Van Kampen is a Christian author, businessman, and private collector of ancient scrolls and things like that. He passed away nearly 20 years ago. So earlier, I think either 1999 or 2000, somewhere around there, he passed away. So over 20 years ago. But he wrote a fascinating book on end time prophecy, and he's got a chapter in his book on the Antichrist. And I thought it was a great way to introduce the topic of the Antichrist by bringing in his notes. So we'll look at that soon. We might get to tonight. We might not, but let's turn back to where we left off last week. We're talking about the 70th week, and I have this particular slide in front of us. It reads, at this point, right, in the study that we've been taking, at this point, let's continue our summary of the 70th week of Daniel by examining an additional interpretation from a slightly different perspective. And we already looked at, I believe it was kingcomments.com earlier. Go back and listen to last week's study if you're not following what I'm saying. But we're going to turn tonight to a Christian blog post by the name of thebiblesays.com. And here's what they have to say about the events that will unfold in those last days, the last 70th week, beginning at the midpoint of the week and going forward. And let me interject and just remind you, let me jump to that different slide again, different view. Remind you that when we're talking about the 70th week of Daniel, we're talking about, from the zoom out perspective, 490 years that God had given this revelation to Daniel of events that would take place on planet Earth and that would have specific impact on the people that Daniel was connected to, i.e. the Jewish people. They would impact the land of Israel. They would impact the temple and the activities that take place in that location of the world. So Daniel was given this vision of 490 years, and it was broken down along the lines of 3 sections: a first section of 7 weeks, a middle section of 62 weeks, and then a final section of 62 weeks, and then 1 week. And we found that the interpretation is that these weeks equal years. So using this particular chart that I've been borrowing from the premillennial, pre-wrath perspective, we see that the time period that we're looking at is the last 7 years, known by most Christians as the tribulation, which I'm going to talk about eventually. I believe that that label is a bit oversimplified when we say the 7-year tribulation. But nevertheless, as we begin to look at the events that take place during those last 7 years on earth, or I shouldn't say the last 7 years, but the last 7-year significant time frame that God gave to Daniel, that last 7 years. And then there's some more even days that trail out of that, like 30 days and 45 days afterwards, that we'll get to eventually. But for now, we're looking at this idea of, what is this last 70th week going to entail? Are you as a Christian going to be suddenly whisked away, raptured out before any 7-year stuff hits the fan? If you know what I'm talking about, any tribulation, hardship hits planet Earth. Is that what the view is? Well, many people believe so. We will eventually get to a talk on rapture views, right? You remember my eschatology schedule there. You see that we're going to be looking at Yeshua's Olivet discourse studies soon. That's in the works. And then when we hit chapter or topic 9 and 10 and 11, we'll be talking about rapture views and things like that. So we will eventually get to those talks. So are you going to be raptured away as a Christian? In other words, maybe it doesn't matter what is going to happen during the 7th week. I mean, if you're just going to be in heaven during all of the mess, then why study the 70th week? Well, what if you're wrong? What if your eschatology was not accurate? What if your end times scheduling and your chart wasn't in line with really what God had planned? And what I'm saying is, I'm not saying you're going to miss the rapture because you're not really saved. Perish that thought. I'm saying, what if you got the rapture timing wrong? What if, in fact, it turns out that the rapture takes place a little bit into the 7th week, say midpoint, or 3/4 of the way in, or halfway through, or at the very end? What if God has determined that we're going to go through the whole thing? Well, my perspective as a pre-wrather is that we aren't going to go through all of it. Rather, the tribulation will take place sometime after the midpoint, and then after that, about halfway into the second half of the 70th week, somewhere in there, we should see some type of rapture. But that's why we're going to be looking at this 70th week, because there's a good possibility that we might go through some Antichrist type of stuff. So let's begin to look at this 70th week. Thebiblesays.com has their blog post, and here's what they have to say about these particular events. Quote, and from this point, for the next few slides, if you notice, the font is italicized, and that will let you know that we're reading this particular blog. So these aren't my thoughts, but I think that these thoughts are beneficial for our study. So that's why I brought them into my study here. Quote, in the middle of this 7-year covenant, the prince will put a stop to sacrifice and grain offerings. Sacrifices and religious practice will be forbidden by this world dictator. The vision in Daniel 7 spoke of this prince changing times and laws. His complete dominance of other nations would last for 3.5 years, according to Daniel 7:25. Important information for us to consider, that as we move into these 70 week, into this final 7-year slice of history, that some type of world leader will make it possible for the people of Israel in the Middle East, namely the Jewish people, those of religious persuasion, will have his hand in allowing sacrifices to be brought back to a preeminent position. Now, whether he's the one that actually brings that specifically to pass, or he's behind the scenes and we don't know it, and they just somehow negotiate with the Arab leaders, the Arab powers that are in control of the Temple Mount area. We know, of course, that, you know, if you're a religious Jew and you go up there on the Temple Mount, that's just like a war zone waiting to happen, right? It's a powder keg. It's you know, if you try to sacrifice any type of animals up there on the Temple Mount, heck, even if you just go up there with your prayer book to pray, right? You can get in trouble, and you can cause all kinds of conflict to spread. I mean, even if it's something just as innocent as one person going up and trying to have some type of prayer service with God from a Jewish perspective, because the whole Temple Mount is deemed kind of property of certain Muslim groups and things like that. Well, then it's kind of basically forbidden, right? Place for Jews to go up there. So you can imagine if they're going to say, hey, let's go up and let's get a sacrificial altar going, right? Somewhere where we can start bringing our sacrifices going again. All kinds of problems would just rise to the forefront, right? You know, peace in the Middle East is always been hanging by a thread. You know, at any moment, just any little incident can tip things in the wrong direction, and all of a sudden you got, you know, rockets flying in both directions, right? You know, I mean, I'm not always saying Israel is the one who's the innocent ones. I'm just saying that people do things that are interpreted by someone else, and then somebody's ready to point a gun at you. So all of this is just very, very what should I say? It's all very detailed information that, from Daniel's perspective, he's just thinking, well, hey, you know, as a people group, as a Jewish people, sacrifices go hand in hand with our worship of God. And now that Israel's back in their land and in control of certain parts of their land, we have to remember that they're still not yet in control of all the places that they would like to be. Let's keep reading this particular commentary. So talking about this idea of a 7-year contract or some type of peace treaty that allows Israel to have a little bit more freedom than what they would now. Obviously, this is also going to affect just the generic, what we might call political perspective in the Middle East. Some type of peace treaty between Israel and her neighbors doesn't have to include animal sacrifice, is the point I'm trying to bring up. So the Antichrist might not have to have his hand in that particular part of the process that Daniel read about or was informed about. Nevertheless, the fact that the Bible talks about him strengthening a covenant or allowing a covenant to have a place where Israel can have peace with their neighbors and the neighbors can have peace with Israel, right? It goes both ways. Then we have to allow, and if we just take scripture in its face value aspect, then this particular leader, whether he's known to be the Antichrist or not, that's not important at the moment. I get the impression that Israel won't know who he truly is. But what is important is, and we'll pick up our reading here, is that this particular detailing about the 7-year contract, whether it's really 7 years on the paper, it could be longer, but Antichrist has his own ideas. This fits with the words of prophecy here and in Daniel 9, that halfway into this 7-year covenant, the prince, this Antichrist figure, would violate the treaty and forbid the Jews from sacrifices. So that's the part that is written in scripture. That's the part, this midpoint activities about the violation of the covenant, what we're going to be reading about as was known as the abomination of desolation, right? This person who rises up and reveals to Israel and the rest of the world that he's not really who he said he was at the beginning of the whatever contract that he makes. This midpoint event is described in the Bible as 3.5 years. Alternately, it's given the name 42 months. What do we say? 1,260 days. So we know the time frame is fairly accurate when we're talking about half point of a 7-year time period. So I don't think there's much question there, because it's been recorded in so many different spots, not just in one book of the Bible. It shows up in other places, and we can corroborate the information and come to some conclusions there. This particular website continues. In 2 Thessalonians, the Apostle Paul writes of the Antichrist, quote, and this is Paul's quote, who opposes and exalts himself above every so-called God of object or God or object of worship, so that he takes his seat in the temple of God, displaying himself as being God, end quote. That's 2 Thessalonians 2:4. We also know that, and we're not going to do this today, we might do this in time, but just this is the overview. We know that from looking at the terminology that Paul left for us in the Greek, the words for temple, temple of God, things like that, it does not necessitate that a full-blown temple edifice be constructed for these events to take place. Indeed, we could have either something as simple as almost like a tabernacle type structure with a place where we can have an altar where blood is poured out, that type of setup, something that's portable even, but doesn't have to necessarily be very big. Also, I was reviewing Tim Hagg's notes on this portion of the Bible in Daniel, and he reminds us in his research that the Greek here supports the idea that perhaps even the Antichrist simply goes up on the Temple Mount and declares himself to be God, or something to that effect. When it says takes a seat in the temple of God, the Greek may even allow for the fact that it's just talking about the current location that we recognize as the Temple Mount. In other words, there might not even have to be really much of a structure put into place. Imagine this, a world leader, 3.5 years into whatever contract in his mind, 3.5 years in, we'll know after the fact, right? At the midpoint, when we see this thing taking place, then we'll retroactively be able to go, that covenant got put together 3.5 years ago, because now we'll know we're at the 3.5 year mark, if we're still here on planet Earth, right? If indeed my perspective of rapture view is accurate, then we'll still be here. And so that'll probably make headlines. Some guy hitting the world scene, opposing and exalting himself above every so-called God or object of worship, right? That's pretty significant. Also, keep in mind, there will be other activities that take place that we're going to read about when we finally get to Yeshua's Olivet Discourse, of Jerusalem itself being surrounded by armies and being besieged, and God allowing Jerusalem to be overtaken and occupied by Antichrist and his military forces. So we know he's going to occupy Jerusalem. We know he's going to attack Jerusalem. And we also know that he's going to destroy any religion that opposes him. He's going to seek to destroy. How much leeway God gives him, that's to be seen. And we'll look at those scriptures in time. We also know that he's going to begin this intense persecution on everyone who doesn't line in step with his particular program, his regime, his military campaigns and things like that. If you don't take his mark, if you don't take his side, so a lot of really bad stuff is going to start unfolding right there from the midpoint going forward, is the point I'm trying to emphasize here. Let's keep reading this blog. Quote, Jesus also talks about this moment, and see, I got ahead of myself if I just have read the slide. Jesus talks about this moment that will take place during the end times, referencing the book of Daniel. Quote, the abomination of desolation, which was spoken of through Daniel the prophet standing in the holy place, end quote. That's lifted from Matthew 24:15. What we're going to do when we finally turn to our study on Antichrist right around the corner, the next topic, we'll continue our look through Daniel, and we'll move from Daniel 9 into chapters 10, 11, and 12, the last 3 chapters of the book of Daniel, where more detail about the activities of the Antichrist as seen not just through the lens of what was near to Daniel, i.e. one of the strongest shadows of the Antichrist, which is, or forerunners of the Antichrist, which is Antiochus Epiphanes, right? Antiochus IV, which was nearer to Daniel than he is to us now. And we'll look at that as we look through Daniel 10, 11, and 12, but realizing that the activities of Antiochus Epiphanes, who is now a historical figure, right? He lived a few centuries before Yeshua, before the first century, realizing that his activities are described in the Bible in a type and shadow type of relationship, where we have a near-term event and a far-term event, or a shadow, which is then gives way to the type itself, right? So we have kind of forerunners, examples of something that's going to happen farther into the future that are already that we can already glean information from looking at the historical earlier incidents. So when we begin to study Antichrist, we'll see more of these details, and we're going to use the book of Daniel to help us out there. Continuing into this particular blog commentary, this prince who is to come, who is the beast, right? Revelation gives him the name the beast. And remember, Daniel, in his dream in Daniel chapter 7, he saw 4 beasts. And then of these 4 beasts, in the 4th beast, which was Rome in the vision, this 4th beast had this peculiar aspect of having, in Daniel's dream, 10 horns, but in Nebuchadnezzar's dream, it was 10 toes. So this 10 aspect of this final empire, this final world power, overlays with the 4th beast, which was Rome. And so we got the near far going on there, the prophetic telescoping of 2 mountain peaks, where the 4th beast is actually the final beast as well. The 4th metal is actually the final empire before Yeshua establishes his final kingdom. This prince who's to come goes by a few other names: Antichrist, the man of lawlessness, the little horn, the king of the north, the beast in the book of Revelation, etc., etc. He's going to forbid worship of other gods, as blog says, and he's going to make himself out to be God, lowercase g, demanding worship. I find it interesting as I interject that since he is a replacement of Yeshua in his mind, he is the Antichrist, right? He's the, even in his title, anti, which can have a connotation of either someone who is an imitation of something else, the genuine, right? Or he's someone who opposes the genuine. So he's the antagonist in our story, right? Yeshua is the protagonist. Yeshua, and this guy's the antagonist, right? If you follow that terminology, he's the bad guy, right? Of the story. But also, he makes himself out to be God, which is quite interesting. If you think from his perspective, he's going to declare himself to be God or deity, and yet we have all of these discussions that I'm having in my later study of apologetics, where I'm arguing for the Trinitarian perspective that Yeshua is very God. Well, if the Antichrist makes himself out to be the antithesis to the true Messiah, right? He's the anti-Messiah, the anti-Messiah, the opposite of Messiah. He's the reverse Messiah. If you follow, like, say, the Flash TV show, there's the Flash, who's the good guy, and then there's the reverse Flash, who's the bad guy, right? If you follow Superman comics, there's Superman, who's the good guy, and then there's Bizarro, who's the kind of reverse of Superman, right? The opposite. So it's this kind of dualistic perspective of good versus bad and bad versus good, the yin yang principle going all over again. So we got Antichrist, we have Christ, and we have Antichrist. Well, if Christ declared himself or demonstrated himself to be God, it seems very reasonable that the Antichrist is also going to have some similar wording. He's going to declare himself or make himself out to be what? Not just a God, not just an inspired or divine man, not just what like non-Trinitarians like to say about Yeshua, he's only human, or he's a what do we say, he's a holy man, he's someone who's been glorified by God, but he's not very deity. But no, the Antichrist is going to say that he's deity, or at least as far as I can tell, he's going to make himself out to say, hey, I'm very God, you need to worship me and stop worshiping everything else. Well, that's going to be bad news for every other religion in the world. I mean, every other religion, not just Christianity, not just Judaism. That's going to have its direct effect when he takes his seat in Jerusalem and in the temple and declares Jerusalem to be his capital. That's not just bad news for the people over there. If he declares himself to be God, here's the point of why I'm bringing this up. If he declares himself to be God, demanding worship of the entire world, this spells bad news for every other religion in the world at that point in time. Okay, so that's what we need to be aware of, is that if we're still alive and on planet Earth during this time, then you're going to have to make a decision. Am I going to worship the one true God, or am I going to cave in to this the demands of this particular beast? This blog continues. Gabriel explains that on the wing of abominations will come one who makes desolate. The beast will make the temple desolate, empty, and assert himself as God in the temple. And of course, indeed, the fact that he desolates the temple and and desecrates it. And if he's following in the footsteps of his forerunner, which is Antiochus Epiphanes, or other beast-type people, he'll be someone that was not only initially thought to be good. Hey, aren't you the guy that we cut a peace treaty with? Hey, aren't you the guy that guaranteed peace between us? I'm speaking as if I'm the Israelis at the time. Aren't you the guy that guaranteed us peace between us and our neighbors? Aren't you the guy that said we could have religious freedom? Aren't you the guy that seemingly brought peace to that part of the world, which is something that no other leader has been able to really accomplish on a long-term scale, right? Aren't you the guy who was on our side? Well, that's when, of course, he reveals his true character, takes off the false mask of peace and says, I'm the devil incarnate. And indeed, we're going to find out that seems to really be the case when the devil gives his authority, his own authority, Satan's authority, to this beast so that he can perform all of these horrendous and heinous things that he does and steps in the footsteps, not just of earlier antichrists such as Antiochus Epiphanes, but in the footsteps of other evil, wicked rulers that we've read about, like Hitler's and Mussolini's, and even in the footsteps of people who earlier were seemingly on God's side, right? Saul was God's chosen, but then he turned and disobeyed God and became an enemy of God and pursued David, right? Forcing David to, hide out in caves and things like that for a good portion of his early life. Or Solomon, my good friend, study buddy, who's in the chat room with us right now, who's in the live Skype room. He and I had a conversation last week, and we talked about how that Antichrist is also, and we'll see this when we get to the book of 1 John. Antichrist is someone who is described as someone who was with us, but now he's not with us. He was someone who left us, which proves that he was never really part of us, but after the fact, noticing that he's a person who we thought he was one of us. We thought he was on our side. We thought he was a true believer or someone who worshiped the true God, but he turned. He left that. He fell from faith. And we know also that this time period is going to be characterized by a falling away, a great falling away of people who profess to be believers. So these are just some of the ideas. We're going to be looking at that more specifically when we get to the Antichrist topic, but I thought I'd kind of whet your appetite for now. Let's keep going in this particular study. Gabriel, this blog says, Gabriel brings his message to a conclusion, explaining to Daniel, of course, that the prince will persist in blasphemies until complete destruction, one that is decreed by God, will be poured out on the one who makes desolate the beast. So we're kind of doing an excursus or an examination or exegetical study on just Daniel 9:27, the last verse. And in so doing, by looking at this final verse in the book of Daniel, we're turned to this topic of this final prince, which, remember, from Daniel's perspective of near far, there's going to be language that is appropriate to assign to the near person in Daniel's vision, which could have been Antiochus Epiphanes, and very likely was, or the near person that showed up around the 70 AD mark, being Vespasian and Titus and the emperors that allowed Jerusalem and the temple to be destroyed, the Jerusalem to be sacked, the Jewish people to be driven out, etc., etc. That is also the prince and the people who came and allowed all of the desolations of the temple, the destruction of Jerusalem, the exile of the people of Israel, the Jewish people from their land, etc., etc. All of that is the shadow for which there's a greater fulfillment. We could say that was a partial fulfillment, for which there's a greater fulfillment, I believe, in the future. Now, again, we talked at length about if you're a preterist, then you, particularly of the hyper-preterist or the full preterist persuasion, then you believe all of this took place in the early parts of 2,000 years ago, 70 AD, 130s, etc., etc. You don't believe there's really any prophecy left to be filled in by some future 7-year time period known as the tribulation or future antichrist, etc., etc. But if you're a partial preterist or what they call themselves Orthodox preterist, I believe they do allow for some final tribulation type of activity to take place, although it's very difficult for me to ascertain exactly how much they hold to. I think they still put most of their hermeneutic understanding of eschatology as taking place in the past. But let's keep reading this particular commentary, this blog. So this particular time frame that we're looking at of the midpoint and going forward, Daniel's already witnessed this destruction in a vision during the reign of King Belshazzar, who preceded King Darius. This vision is recorded in Daniel 7, where the beast's destruction is described. We're talking about from the midpoint going forward, God has decreed that it's going to be hell on earth for us for a while, but God will ultimately rescue his people. Remember, the vision that was given Daniel ends on a positive note. If we go back to the vision in Daniel 7, it ends on a positive note with the rock coming that was cut without hands and striking the statue in Daniel 2, but the Ancient of Days being approached by the one who's like the Son of Man in Daniel 7, right? That's the one-to-one correlation. This signifies the Messianic kingdom that's going to be established here on earth by Yeshua himself. So that's the positive note that the vision ends on. And so this particular blog reminds us that that event that allows God's kingdom to be established on earth spells the end of the dominion of the Antichrist and of the final, what we might call, effort of humanity to thwart God's plans and to thumb their nose at God's Messiah and to say no to his plans. God says, nope, in the end, I'm going to have my way because I'm more powerful, because I'm very God and I represent all that is truth. And what my word says stands. It's forever established. It cannot be changed. And because God decreed that the Antichrist will come to an end and the final beast empire will be destroyed and the beast slain, then that's what we can look forward to. And so this blog post puts it this way. This vision is recorded in Daniel 7, where the beast's destruction is described using this language, quote, the beast was slain and its body was destroyed and given to the burning fire, Daniel 7:11. We keep reading. This will conclude the 70 weeks of this message. The first 69 weeks happened in succession. That is 7 weeks plus 62 weeks, right? Remember that chart? Let me flip over to that real quick. 7 weeks being the 49 years, followed immediately by the 62 week, which was the 434 years. You can see those two on your chart. So that represents history gone by. And then we had the cross event, a big cross right there in the middle of your chart. And then we had this gap that we're living in now, the church age or the times of the Gentiles, the diaspora, if you want to call it that, that's fine. And then we're looking forward to this final 7 years. Of course, this is a non-preterist looking chart. The preterists would smash all of the three sections of the 7, the 62, and the 1 all back together. But this blog says that the first 69 weeks happened in succession, one after another, which is very interesting that there's no gap between any 7, the first 7 and the 69. They all worked, one right after another, no gap or anything. But notice this chart also, this blog post mentions, but the last week, the 7 years, has yet to happen. So we're talking about a gap. They describe it as a clock being on pause. I know some people who don't like talking about the fact that there is a gap, or they disagree with the perspective that there's a gap. Again, preterists are of that persuasion that there isn't really a gap. But there's language in Daniel's prophecy that suggests that even if you don't say there's a 2,000-year gap, you have to still say there's some gap of years, because Messiah is cut off after the 69 weeks. So there has to be a gap there. It's afterwards. And then, of course, the destruction of the temple and the plowing under of Jerusalem also take place after the 69 weeks. So there has to be some gap. It just depends on how big it is. But the clock is on pause, this blog says. The first event that started the clock ticking was a decree to rebuild. The next event that will start the clock ticking will be a firm covenant. Again, we don't know for certain what that wording of the covenant will be, whether it will be 7 years, what will be longer, whether it will be announced by the parties involved. One thing is probably certain. If you are even remotely aware of what's going on in the world, if you live in a place where you have access to some measured amount of news information, then when there is some form of lasting peace in the Middle East between Israel and her neighbors, that will surely make world headlines. I can't imagine why it wouldn't, right? Whenever there's some type of accord that takes place in the Middle East that's brokered between Israel and her neighbors and the surrounding Muslim powers and Arab states around her, that always makes headlines. It always does. So I can't imagine it would be any different. So the next event that will start the clock ticking will be a firm covenant. Will we know that it's 7 years? Well, we may not. Will the Antichrist announce his plans? Hey, I'm making a 7-year contract with Israel and her neighbors. I mean, that would be great if he just took away all of the secrecy and made it plain right up front. But we don't know. But one thing's for certain. If Israel enters into some form of peaceful negotiation, and we're not just talking about a ceasefire. We're talking about something that appears to be lasting. From Israel's perspective and from the perspective of her neighbors, it's probably something that will have language that describes, lasting peace, not just let's stop firing at each other, not just like we said, a laying down of our arm, or what we might call let's stop firing at each other. I think it'll be more. The wording will be stronger than that. Let's keep reading. This blog continues. The text says that after the 62 weeks, the Messiah will be cut off and have nothing, right? We're talking about this gap period. It does not say he will be cut off during the final week, but after the 62 weeks, indicating that there is time between the consecutive 69 weeks and the final week of prophecy. So again, even if you're a full-blown preterist, then you have to recognize that there are details and activities that take place between the 69 weeks and the final 7 that seem to allow for some passage of time between those two time frames. This blog continues. It says that there's time between the consecutive 69 weeks and the final week of prophecy. The final 7 is discussed separately from the first 69 sevens. There is a clear gap in this prophetic message, and I agree with this particular website's sentiment. I think it's apparent that even at face value that Daniel was giving us these threefold breakdown of 7 weeks, which is 49 years, and then the 62 weeks, let me go back to our chart, the 62 weeks, which was 434 years. And then whether we say there's a gap or not, we at least have to recognize that Daniel uses the language of in the middle of the week, he will make a covenant for 1 week, and in the middle of the week, so he describes the final 7 year. Either way, there seems to be the language that tells us that the breakdown must be there. There is a clear gap in this prophetic message, according to my understanding. Let's continue. From the present, we can look back and see that all the events of the first 69 weeks have happened. A decree was made, Jerusalem was rebuilt, as well as the events after the 69 weeks happened, i.e. the death of the Messiah and the destruction of Jerusalem. This is kind of a summary and conclusion to our look at the book of Daniel, and not the book of Daniel, but summary conclusion on the initial overview of Daniel's 70 weeks. And we're now drawing our summary and conclusions about the final 70th week in our particular study. This blog says, but the final 7 years is reserved for the future. It contains the final abominations, rebellions, and wicked rulers on earth before God restores his creation fully. They continue. When the last week is finished, the promises in verse 24 will come to pass. Remember those promises? Let me just bring up a look at those promises real quick, just to remind you. I had this pulled up earlier, but it's in verse 24 of Daniel. Let's blow that up. Remember, these are the promises that God gave to Daniel. 70 weeks have been decreed for your people and your holy city. Look at these 6 things. To finish the transgression, that's 1. To make an end of sin, that's 2. To make atonement for iniquity, that's 3. To bring in everlasting righteousness, that's 4. To seal up vision and prophecy, that's 5. And to anoint the most holy place, that's 6. Of course, there are different ways to interpret these 6. We could say that the last one, for instance, is to anoint the most holy person, since literally it just says to anoint the most holy in the Hebrew, the Kadosh Kadashim. But either way you look at it, God promised through Daniel, through the prophecies given to Daniel, that God would make these things come to pass. And of course, God is going to keep his word, and God's going to make these things come to pass using his chosen servant, Messiah, Yeshua. Yeshua is the only one who can bring all of these things to pass. And indeed, we could say that the first 3 were brought to some form of partial completion at the death of Messiah, but a full completion in the spiritual sense, right? Finish the transgression. Yeshua brought the fullness of payment for transgressions and sins against God by dying on the cross. To make an end of sin, Yeshua brought the final death blow to sin by dying and being resurrected and being seated at the right hand of his Father. Sin has now been defeated because of the work on the cross, and to make atonement for iniquity. That is the purpose of Yeshua bringing his blood before the altar of God in heaven, to make atonement for the iniquity and the sins, not of himself, but for the sins of all humanity, or those who would call upon his name as Lord and Master and Savior. But notice the final three: to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy. Those things have yet to have a final future fulfillment. So let's go back to this blog. They talk about that God will finish the transgressions of the world and bring in everlasting righteousness. I mean, look at Israel today. Has she atoned for her, or well, let me say it this way. Has she accepted the atonement that Messiah offered up on her behalf? Not on your life. She's still largely in a place of spiritual blindness where she rejects the atonement of Messiah. She rejects the righteousness that he offers through his sacrificial death on the cross. And so she is in need corporately of this fulfillment on her behalf. Individually, she can step into that. And, Baruch Hashem, there are Jews who have been accepting Yeshua down through history in scores and in numbers. In the first century, there were myriads, right? Several thousands of Jews who came to believe that Yeshua was, in fact, the promised Messiah that they read about in their scriptures. But right now, by and large, for the most part, national Israel is still in blindness. Go back and read Romans chapter 11 all over again. God will finish the transgression of the world and bring in everlasting righteousness, not just for the world, not just for the church, but for Israel. Look what this blog post has to say. This has not yet happened. The book of Revelation covers the final 3.5 years in great detail. In Revelation chapters 6 through 16, this 3.5 year period is likely the time referred to by Jesus as the time of great tribulation in the book of Matthew. We'll turn to that in time, but let's keep working our way through this blog post. They continue. The chapter ends without further explanation or commentary from Daniel, right? Just cuts off abruptly. We have to finish the story by reading through the rest of Daniel's book, which will not, again, this is not a deep dive into the book of Daniel, but we will borrow some of the notes from chapters 10 through 12 when we start turning to look at the campaigning of the Antichrist, both preceding at the early parts of the week and the latter half of the week. We'll look at those details when we get to our study on the Antichrist. This blog continues. Doubtless, speaking of Daniel, he was astounded by the message. He had begun with a prayer hoping that God would restore Jerusalem and Judah to the Jewish people. The answer was beyond his expectations, which is this: Jerusalem will be rebuilt. It will also be destroyed again. But God is working to do more than restore a city. And then their final slide reads this way: he is working to end all sin and establish eternal righteousness, right? The bringing in of the kingdom. Let me turn to that slide one more time. Notice that in the slide that I have here, we see that the last week ends with the second advent of the Messiah, the coming to planet Earth physically, bodily. We're not just rapturing where we're yanking the saints up and pulling us into heaven, but Yeshua coming and returning with his saints to planet Earth to establish his kingdom of 1,000 years, which we believe is the literal 1,000-year millennial kingdom, which takes place at the far right of the chart that you're looking at right now. So going back to this final slide in this particular blog, God's final purpose is to bring an end to sin and establish eternal righteousness. This is God's final purpose for the earth, to redeem it and to put away wickedness forever. But it's also going to include putting an end to sin within national Israel as they finally look on him whom they've pierced and mourn for him as one mourns for an only son, like we read about in Zechariah chapter 14. Despite Daniel's exile, he's given a message of hope and blessing far greater than he imagined. And that's the message that we also need to remind ourselves as we're working our way through these studies. If you read through the prophecies that are given to us in the Old Testament, there's a lot of doom and gloom in there, a lot of destruction of Israel, a lot of destruction of nations surrounding Israel, right? We talk about the destruction of Babylon and the falling of Babylon and things like that. God has the final say in demonstrating that he's going to establish righteousness in the earth. He's not going to allow his plans to be thwarted, no matter how evil and wicked things get in the world, right? When Antichrist finally comes to power, and at the midpoint of the week, he shows who he truly is, not just to Israel, but to the rest of the world, demands worldwide worship, implements the mark of the beast, and forbids anyone from buying and selling unless they have the mark and worship him and worship them and take the mark. And he's going to be persecuting Christians and anyone who opposes him, Jewish people. He goes out to make war with the saints and overcome them. He's even going to be, there's going to be a great tribulation at that time that will surpass anything that's ever happened in the world up to that point, if we take Yeshua's words literally and factually. And so this will be the time of Jacob's trouble, but it'll also be the time of trouble where the entire world is teetering and tottering back and forth. We read about some of the language in the prophecies. The point I'm bringing up is that no matter how bad it gets in the world with the demonic deception and the great falling away that Paul talks about in his Thessalonian chapter books, letters, no matter how bad it gets, like we're going to read about in the book of Revelation with all the plagues and the locusts and the fire and the lions and tigers and bears, oh my, all of that is going to come to a conclusion when Yeshua establishes his kingdom on earth physically, right, bodily here, like we read about, like we saw in the vision of the statue where the stone strikes the statue at the feet, at the toe level, at that stage. That gives us kind of an indicator of the timing that we're looking at. The stone strikes the statue, not at the head or the chest or in the midsection, but on the toe section, right when the last final beast empire is in power, when the 10-nation coalition is in power, when the Antichrist is thinking that he probably cannot be equaled or rivaled or defeated. God's going to sorely disappoint him. Likewise, in Daniel's vision of the beasts, when the one like the Son of Man approaches the Ancient of Days, it's during the stages of that last great dreadful beast who tramples the entire earth, and the time of the 10 horns and the little horn who plucks out 3 before him, right? That's the time frame that we're looking at. So it's not all doom and gloom, is the point I'm trying to say. And we talked about this last week. The only way that we are going to make it as humans, right, on this time period, because we can't withstand the onslaught of Antichrist on our own as human beings. The only way we're going to be able to make it is if we cling to the one who has defeated death itself, the only one who is the true champion in God's playbook, and that is his son Messiah Yeshua. You've got to know him. You've got to have a relationship with him. Let's keep going through our slides here. So with these details before us, there are, in my opinion, a few questions that naturally come to mind concerning Daniel's prophecy. Let's take the last, say, 10, 15 minutes to look at the final slides. We're basically on slide 53 of 80. I don't think we'll make it through all of the slides. Obviously, we'll keep going with this. I'm not rushing the material, but let's get into some of these questions that I've put together. First questions. These are in no particular order. These are just questions that I found relevant for this type of study. Question. First, why is this prophecy important, and what is the relevancy? What is the relevance to the church and to end times, right? These are questions you might have as a Christian or even as a non-Christian, right? Here's an answer that I have come up with. It's not the final answer, and you could probably come up with a better answer, but this is the answer that I have put together. So notice that the font is not italics anymore. That means these are my own thoughts. This is a study I put together 20 years ago, right? And then I had to kind of rework it and retool it for this study here in 2023. But most of it's still the same. So the question is, why is this prophecy important that we read about in Daniel, and what's the relevance to the church and to end times? Answer. Jesus' disciples asked him what would be the sign of the end of the age and the sign of his return in Matthew 24, which is known as the Olivet Discourse. We'll get to that in time, remember? Jesus replied by telling them what to expect. And so he gives them some things to look forward to, not necessarily things that you would want to happen. When I say look forward to, not in a good sense, but negative things that are going to be happening, but nevertheless, you can watch for them, right? False Christs, wars, rumors of wars, desolation, famine, persecution, going along with the same question. And then he refers to the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet, right? Matthew 24:15. So all of this language that Jesus warned us about, that the Messiah gave us in advance, gives us this sense of We might not know the exact timing of the events, but at least we can discern the season. We can discern the kind of the sentiments of the age, the signs that precede what's really coming down the pike. The point that I'm highlighting is that he didn't just say to his disciples, well, don't worry about it. When it happens, it's going to happen, and you guys just need to be ready. No, he actually answered their question in a very, very detailed way. We'll see when we get to those chapters in Matthew and Mark and in Luke. In bold, I write these notes. Understand, Jesus was telling the disciples what would transpire just prior to his return, and specifically mentions the events of Daniel 9:27. So that's very, very important. Here's another question that came to my mind that I hope that you're considering the answer to as well. Question: if the 70th week is yet to be fulfilled, like I believe it is from a futurist perspective, why is there such a long gap between the 69th and the 70th weeks? Again, this is a question whose answer is really open for discussion with the preterists, those who believe there isn't really a gap. So listen to my answer, or an answer that might sound similar to what other futurists would also add or lend to the table. Consider what has transpired in the intervening years. The Jews were dispersed to wander without a home for nearly 19 centuries, but in that same time period, the Church of Jesus Christ was established among the Gentiles. Shaul speaks of this at length in Romans chapters 9 through 11. So, continuing along with this question about why is there a gap, notice what Paul says in Romans, quote, "For I do not desire, brethren, that you should be ignorant of this mystery, lest you should be wise in your own opinion, that blindness in part has happened to Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in." So what I have to say, continuing along with this particular answer about why the gap, when the fullness of the Gentiles has come in, this phrase that Paul introduced into his book, the veil of blindness will be lifted from Israel's eyes, and the remnant of Israel will be saved in Jesus, the Messiah. So we're talking about, when we go back over to that chart about the gap, the church age, it's a time that is dominated not really by Israel as a people group, but rather by the Gentiles as people. And this is why we have confidence that there is a gap, because we know from hindsight and from reading through other New Testament passages that there is this mystery of the Gentile inclusion into the people of God as Gentiles. It was not really a mystery that the Gentiles would be included in God's people. That really was told all the way back to Abraham, when God said, "I will bless those that bless you, curse those that curse you, and through you all the nations," i.e. Gentiles, Goyim, people groups around you, the peoples of the world, "through you all the nations of the earth will be blessed." Genesis chapter 12. So we know that the Gentiles would always have a place in God's economy and in God's people, but the mystery was, how would they fit in? According to Israel, and the mystery, and I'll put a little graphic on the screen to show this, according to national Israel's speculation, according to their figuring out of things, Gentiles would come into Israel via conversion. They would have to change their status from Gentile, become a Jew, and they would join the people group as Jews. So thus, the people of God would always really be composed and comprised of Jewish peoples, whether you're natural born or convert, but either way, you're Jewish. That was their perspective, at least as it came to be articulated in the first century and later, or the first few centuries before the first century, following the Maccabean period and going forward with the first forced physical circumcision and things like that. So they were really confused by physical circumcision, the act of circumcision, turning a person into a Jew, etc., etc. But Paul was given the revelation that no, that's not the way the Gentiles are to be included into the people group of God. It's a mystery to Israel. They were blinded to that. God knew of it. It was a mystery to the Jewish people, but it was not a mystery to God. So that's why Paul says that when the fullness of the Gentiles comes in, meaning the full measure of the people that God has determined are going to be joining the family of God, after that takes place, then the veil of blindness on Israel will be lifted from her eyes, and the remnant of Israel will be saved in Jesus the Messiah, i.e., as we work our way towards the culmination of the end of the age, then Israel's blindness will be removed. I continue. The fullness of the Gentiles will come in, and the blindness of Israel's remnant will be lifted during the second half of Daniel's 70th week. And that's a very important event for us to look forward to. Let's continue with the particular questions that I formulated. How do we know the first seals of the first seals of Revelation 6 are within the 70th week of Daniel? So we're talking about questions that arise when you have a study on the 70th week, the final 7-year slice of history that is primarily given over to humanity. How do we know that the first seals of Revelation are within? For instance, when I listen to Bible preachers today, prophecy teachers, many of them are fond of saying, well, we don't have to say that all of the seals are in the 70th week. Maybe, because we'd have wars and rumors of wars, false Christ, we've had earthquakes in diverse places, we've had all kinds of political unrest, religious persecution going on for thousands of years, right? And especially in the church age, the church has been persecuted for the last 1900 years or so. So why do we have to smash everything or collect everything into the final 7 years? Okay. That's a good question. And my understanding as an end times Bible prophecy buff and a futurist is that most of the concentrated events will take place in the 70th week, and there's good reason for it. Here's my answer. Let's take a look at a chart to remind us what the 7 seals of Revelation chapter 6 entail. Afterwards, we will label each seal and place all 7 into Daniel's final week of 7 years. So I'm not going to bring up a reading of the book of Revelation. We'll get to that in time, but just be aware that in the book of Revelation, the writer, which is John, the Revelator, he's shown by Yeshua several visions with several details, and among them, there are 7, in this order, there are 7 seals, 7 trumpets, and 7 bowls. And these seals, trumpets, and bowls describe different events that unfold before John's eyes in apocalyptic fashion, in symbolic fashion, in visionary fashion, but they correspond to events that will take place on earth. And I believe that there is what we might call a chronology to it. In other words, when we read the book of Revelation in its most natural, literal, historical, grammatical sense, there's a chronology to the book of Revelation. And so in this chart that I've got in front of you, it's a very simple chart. There are 7 seals of the book of Revelation, and we can see, reading from left to right, there's the white horse for seal 1. There's the red horse for seal 2. There's a black horse for seal 3. And then there's a pale horse for seal 4. We call these the 4 horses of the apocalypse or something to that effect. And then in the 5th seal, we have the souls crying out, souls under the altar crying out for vengeance from God to avenge their blood. This is what we might call the great martyrdom on planet Earth at that time, the 5th seal. And then moving from left to right, we have these earthquake on the earth, sun, moon, and stars losing their brilliance, right? These, what we might call the cosmic disturbances in seal 6. And then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. The final one is silence in heaven. Shh. Right? You see the guy with his finger saying, shh, let's be quiet. So these are the 7 seals of the book of Revelation. Well, how do they correspond with the book of Daniel? Let's go back to our question and answer. How do we know the first seals of Revelation 6 are within the 70th week of Daniel? Well, according to my understanding of the timing of these events, when we place these events into Daniel's final 70th week of years, which is still future, the 7 seals look like this. And this is according to, again, a premillennial, pre-wrath model. So let's bring in one more chart. This time, we've got the 70th week of Daniel in this particular chart. This is in agreement with a premillennial, pre-wrath. And notice we've got the full 7 years indicated by a green slice that says 7 years there. And then underneath that, it's broken down into the 3.5 years and the 3.5 years at the beginning and at the end. So look at the very bottom of the chart. We've got the first seal, which is Antichrist. The second seal, which is World War. Remember the horses, right? We had the white horse at the very beginning. That's Antichrist. And then the second seal, which was the red horse, is World War. The third seal, which was the black horse, is famine. And then the fourth seal, which was the kind of the pale horse, kind of an eggshell white or something that effect, pale horse, is mass death. And then we got the midpoint. So this is a kind of a rough chronology, according to my understanding of not just the 70th week of Daniel, but eventually we'll see how this fits in with the book of Revelation. in more detail. And then continuing, going from left to right, in other words, chronologically moving forward, the fifth seal, where we have the people under the altar crying out to God, that's the martyred dead who are now asking God to avenge their deaths. And then we get to the sixth seal, which was the cosmic disturbances in the sun, the moon, and the stars, the earthquakes on earth and things like that. But primarily it's the signs in the sky. And then notice this chart doesn't have the seventh seal, which is basically, well, I mean, it does, but it's up above. The seventh seal, which was the silence in heaven, which begins the initiation of, according to this chart, the trumpets plus the bowls. Basically, kind of giving you a little bit of sneak preview as we're drawing this study to a close tonight. We'll pick this up next week with some more questions. Basically, as far as I can ascertain, of the seven seals that are broken in the book of Revelation, the seventh seal itself contains or signifies the beginning of the seven trumpets, which will be sounded. And then when we get to the seventh trumpet itself, it actually signals the beginning of the seven bowls. So in that perspective, we could say that all of the bowls are contained, the seven bowls are contained within the seventh trumpet, and all the trumpets are contained within the seventh seal itself, something to that effect. But it still plays itself out chronologically. Look at the top of the chart. At the beginning of this last 7 years, according to my understanding as a pre-mill, pre-trib, Antichrist makes a covenant, or he strengthens a covenant. Again, the language can go either way. I wouldn't be surprised if he makes his own brand new covenant with his own proprietary language, his own wording that suits his agendas. Could be that he creates and drafts a covenant that's not on the books, but I wouldn't be surprised if he simply just reuses one that's already available. So he makes a covenant very early on, and that signifies the beginning of the 70th year, the 70th week in earnest, or in what we could say in specific, right? We might not know that it begins until we get into the 3-year period, but then retroactive, we're like, wow, this has been going on for 3.5 years. In other words, when the abomination of desolation takes place, which Yeshua highlighted, and I'm saying this in closing, so it must be something that's not secret. Remember, the disciples ask him, what are going to be the signs of the end of the age and your return? And Yeshua gives them all of these beginnings of birth pangs, the seals 1 through 4, etc. But then Yeshua switches his language to indicate that there's going to be this midpoint event that should really grab your attention, because when we get to the book of Luke, we're going to find out that at that same midpoint, that Jerusalem is going to find herself surrounded by her armies. In fact, I believe Antichrist will already have his armies parked there in Jerusalem as a sign of saying, hey, we're here to protect you. But in reality, it's just going to turn the guns, swing them 180 degrees, and point them at Jerusalem instead of away from Israel towards Israel's enemies, right? But it'd be easy if Antichrist was already occupying Jerusalem peacefully for the first 3.5 years until he finally takes his mask off and just turns the guns towards Israel and begins his persecution of Israel and destroying Jerusalem, etc., etc. So Antichrist makes a covenant. So we might not know when the covenant starts, right? That might be kind of secretive or whatever. But we can definitely say, I believe with certainty, when the midpoint event takes place. That's my understanding. I could be wrong, but the fact that Yeshua highlighted it and brought it to the disciples' attention, and the fact that we have a forerunner in Antiochus Epiphanes, which we're going to look at in time, where he desecrated the temple, and that's a momentous event. The fact that we have all of that information and perspective leads me to the impression that this is not something that will be secretive. So the abomination of desolation is right there in the middle. And then looking at the top of the chart and in closing, we have the coming of the Son of Man, date unknown, meaning sometime after the Great Tribulation starts, but before the 7-year ends, before the final 3.5 years, we have the coming of the Son of Man, meaning the rapture takes place, where God allows Yeshua to snatch away the church from planet Earth to protect her from completely being wiped out. In fact, Yeshua describes it somewhere along the lines of that, unless those days were shortened, there would no flesh be saved, right? I don't think he's shortening the 3.5 years or the 7 years. I think what he's talking about, unless the days of persecution, the days of tribulation are shortened. And then final on the very top of the chart. So we have the coming of the Son of Man, which is the rapture. And then we have Jesus' reign in Jerusalem beginning at the far end, the far right of the chart, where the that yellow arrow is pointing off to the right. So don't get confused the second coming of Christ with the rapture of the saints. Don't get those two events confused. The rapture of the saints is Yeshua gathering us and collecting us, and we get snatched away and we go up. But the second coming of Messiah is where we come back down. The saints go up and the wrath comes down, right? So we'll talk about these in more detail. We have some more questions and answers. We'll continue to look at this question here about how do we know that the first seals of Revelation 6 are within the 70th week of Daniel? And we'll continue looking at this question. But that'll do it now for Eschatology, a biblical study of end time events. These are the live internet studies brought to you week after week by myself, Ariel ben-Lyman, HaNaviy. I'm a Torah Teacher at Congregation Keilat Nevada Harvest in Thornton, Colorado. Find us online at grafted.com and join us in person for our live Sabbath services. But if you're not able to join us, at least as I mentioned, join us online, and you can see the link to the video right there on my screen as well. These live internet studies are a part of my own Torah teaching ministry, which parks itself on the web at tetzetorah.com. That's tetzetorah.com. I'd love to have you join me at my own home personal website there and browse around and take a look through all the commentaries that you see on my screen right now as well. I also have a YouTube channel that I'd be delighted if you popped in and took a look around there as well. youtube.com/c/Tetze Torah Ministries. If you do hit my website, my YouTube channel there, be sure to take notice that I update the site essentially daily, uploading videos daily. Make sure then to subscribe, hit the bell for notifications, leave thumbs up for all the videos that you like. Leave me some comments and questions about things you have your own thoughts on, and be sure to share the content with your other friends and family members in your social media circles, okay? Just some brief important details. If you'd like to join us for our live studies, be sure to get access to Skype somehow. If you're on my website right now, during the live study and you click on that blue Skype link, it'll actually open up Skype in your browser and you can just join us right there. And we hope you can join us live, because we engage in live Q&A after the study is over, opening up the microphones, and it's exclusively to the live studies that we engage in that live study Q&A. But if not, take one last moment to scroll to the very bottom of my website, where you can see some Hebrew writing and the black section down there, and prayerfully consider partnering with me to take the Torah around the world in this particular format. You can click on the little yellow donate button and bless me that way with your financial gifts and contributions. And I'm so blessed to be able to be in a place where I can receive your generous gifts. Thank you to all of those who have given in the past and are continuing to give. I'm so thrilled to be on the receiving end of your generosity. And as I always say, be blessed as you seek to be a blessing to others. Let's turn to a Trinitarian response to biblical Unitarianism. My name is Ariel ben-Lyman, HaNaviy. We are looking at biblicalunitarian.com's website, which is a website about God and his son, Jesus Christ. And we've been discussing the passage out of the book of Psalm, chapter 45, verse 6, "Your throne, O God, will last forever," from their perspective. So let's read the passage out of the NIV as they have it posted to their website. "Your throne, O God, will last forever and ever. A scepter of justice will be the scepter of your kingdom," out of the NIV. Notice on the screen that their explanation of the verse is quoted. They remind us that it's quoted in the book of Hebrews, chapter 1, verse 8. And so their explanation is found there. And so indeed, let's turn to their explanation and just remind ourselves what the non-Trinitarian perspective on this verse is. And then I'm going to try and finish this tonight. If I don't, it'll only go into one more week. But I think we're getting the idea from a non-Unitarian perspective of why I believe that this verse is best understood as referring to Yeshua and his deity. But here's what they have to say. They make a case that the translation of the wording, the translation of the verse where it says, "Your throne, O God, is forever and ever," that translation is found in most standard English translations and most Trinitarian sounding Christian translations, is not the best translation. They say it's an option. It is an optional translation, but they opt for a translation that reads something like, "Your throne is God forever." That first clause about "Your throne, O God, is forever and ever," instead of using what we've come to know as the vocative, where we address someone directly, They opt for what's known as the nominative, which is possible. Your throne is God forever, meaning, and this is their explanation, this is their website, biblicalunitarian.com. This means that God is the authority, the throne of the king, and the king reigns with the authority of God. This king, and by extension the Messiah, the true king of Israel, has been specially anointed by God. So their perspective is that the psalmist, as well as the writer to the book of Hebrews, was not declaring Jesus as God when he says, "Your throne, O God, is forever and ever." Instead, if we say your throne is God forever, we're simply saying your authority is from God, that God has granted you, and therefore that's why you are a righteous king, etc., etc. So let's remind ourselves what the passages say in Hebrew and in Greek, and begin to look once more at some of the structural analysis, finishing up the verse translations. We dead ended last week at the Jehovah's Witnesses. We'll pick up again. But first I want to read the English, then the Hebrew, then the Greek. So this is NASB in front of you. Your throne, O God, is forever and ever. The phrase, O God, is what is known as vocative, V-O-C-A-T-I-V-E. I'll show a little chart on the screen here that explains the difference between vocative and nominative in a moment. But I'm just making you aware that your translator is going to display his bias to the original Hebrew or Greek based on the way he understands the context of any given passage and the message that's trying to be conveyed by the original writer, which we're going to find out in the end, if we can get to it tonight. The final authority is really what God gave to the biblical writer at the time, and the context of the way they were being shown the revelation of whatever it is they were to write. It really doesn't matter so much what we later translators of the Bible have to say. In the end, God's word is authoritative in the sense that what God gave to the original writer and the context that was driving what they saw is what should be the final say. You'd be surprised how much translators wiggle there around that. But your throne, O God, is forever and ever. A scepter of uprightness is the scepter of your kingdom. So there are two parts to this verse that are of interest to us from the original languages. One is the clause, O God. What does that look like in the Hebrew and the Greek? And then lastly, notice that this particular translation out of the NSB says, a scepter of uprightness is the scepter of your kingdom. We're going to find that there are other translations that don't say your kingdom. There are other translations that say his kingdom, which changes the perspective of who is the writer addressing, right? If you're addressing God, then we would say the scepter of your kingdom, first person. You, O God, the kingdom of you, right? O God. But if it says the scepter of his kingdom, but we just got through addressing God, doesn't that sound a little bit odd? Sounds like we suddenly jump into third person. All right, let me show you the Hebrew just real quick. The Hebrew says, Kisacha Elohim Olam Ve'ed, the first clause, Kisacha, the throne of you, or your throne, Elohim, God, Olam Ve'ed, forever and ever. And the verb is supplied by context. Kisach Elohim Olam Ve'ed, that's the first clause. And notice the very first word over here is Kisacha, is the Hebrew construct of a noun plus the suffix indicating possession, the throne of you, or we smooth it out in English by saying your. So your throne. Not his throne. That would be a different word, a different way to be expressed in Hebrew. But notice the verse continues by saying, Shevet mishor shevet malchutecha. And so over here at the very end of the verse in Hebrew, malchutecha is the same construction, noun plus the personal pronoun indicating the kingdom of you, or we smooth it out by saying your kingdom. If it said malchuto instead of malchutecha, then it would be the kingdom of his, or we smooth it out by saying his kingdom. But notice it doesn't say shevet malchuto. It says shevet malchutecha. What does that mean? It means the kingdom of you, or we smooth it out by saying your kingdom, the one that he possesses. Okay, so that's the Hebrew. Let's look at Hebrews as it's taken this verse out of the book of Psalms and rendered it. This is Hebrews chapter 1, verse 8. And in the context, we're jumping into context, but notice that the writer to the book of Hebrews signals who he's referring to by saying, but of the Son. It's a contrast between speaking of the angels and of the Son. If we were to back up a verse, we would say, and of the angels, he says in verse 7, who makes his angels winds and his ministers a flame of fire. And then contrast, but of the Son, he says, and the he is God, God the Father. Speaking of the angels in verse 7, and now speaking of the Son, the writer to the book of Hebrews says, but of the Son, he says, and then we have our quote from the book of Psalms. Your throne, O God, is forever and ever, and the righteous scepter is the scepter of, and we have his kingdom again, right? Notice in earlier, let me pull it up, the scepter of your kingdom. Notice a slight difference. In the same Bible translation, NASB, from the Hebrew, we had the scepter of your kingdom, from the Hebrew of Malchutecha. And now in the Greek, or the book of Hebrews, we have the righteous scepter is the scepter of his kingdom. Why does it say his kingdom? We still have the your throne, O God, right? The vocative there. Let's look at the Greek and see if we can glean any details from there. The Greek says pros deton huion. That's but of the Son. Now we have our clause ha thronos su ha theos. Ace ton iona to ionos kai. Let me pause between the clauses. First clause, pros deton huion, but of the Son, he says. And then we have our quote from starting in the book of Psalms, starting right there. Ha thronos su, the throne of you, ha theos, O God. Ace is ton iona, the ages of the ages. Iona to ionos. That's the first basic clause. The throne of you, O God, is forever and ever, or is from the ages to the ages. We could render it that way. The ionas literally ages, or something that effect. We just rendered as from forever to forever, or is forever and ever, like it said in the Hebrew olam ve'ed. But hathronos su, the throne of you. This particular Greek word, right? Let's see if I can highlight it. There we go. That particular Greek word, hathronos su, the throne of you. So your throne. Ha theos, the next phrase there in the Greek, ha thronos, ha theos, O God, or the God, or just God. It shows up as a vocative in the lexiconic dictionaries that we pull up. But in its most normative sense, like in the translation from the Septuagint, which we'll see here in a moment, it doesn't have to be vocative. It's just a standard nominative, just a standard noun, right? It can be rendered as the God, or we take out the word the and just render it as God. So your throne, God. But it continues. Eis tan iona tu ionas kai he chrabdas tes euthu tetas chrabdas tes basileas su. And this final phrase down at the bottom, let me highlight it for you. Tes basileas su, the kingdom of you, or we smooth it out in our translations as your kingdom. Notice this corresponds with the English of his kingdom, the kingdom of him. I should have said your kingdom. The kingdom of him, tes basileas su, the kingdom that is his, the scepter of his kingdom. Now, this is in contrast to some other translations, which we're going to see here in a moment, that say your kingdom instead of his kingdom. It seems like it changes the person. All right, so I don't want to get too deep into that portion of the Greek right just yet. Let's keep looking at the structural analysis. Well, you know what? Now is a good time to look into the Greek. I apologize. I actually do want to look at the Greek right now. Let me blow that up just a little bit more for us. I think maybe that should be good. Look at these renderings from the Greek. Let's just highlight using these two versions. The NAS 27 and UBS4 variants has this final clause, and it shows it using variant form. Tes basileas autu / su. Why would we have two different options for the final wording? Just so you know, I'll show this to you in the Byzantine majority text. As you know, there's three
really important manuscript families that are out there, of which two are the maybe what we might call the primary, and a third one, which is one that we also need to be aware of, but it isn't one of the primaries. It's more of a minority, just because of how many manuscripts have survived time. And the manuscripts I'm talking about from age, from the oldest going up to the more current of the three, are the Sinaiticus, which is symbolized by the letter Aleph in the Hebrew. So Sinaiticus is one of the older manuscripts. And to that, so that's 4th century. Along with that, we also have what's known as the Vaticanus, which is signified by the letter B, the symbol that's given to these particular codices. So symbol B, I believe, is Vaticanus. And then that's also 4th century. And then along with that, Alexandrinus. And then Vaticanus is symbolized by the letter A. Let's try it one more time. I'm going to put a little graphic on the screen so that I'm not getting confused. So we have Sinaiticus, then we have Alexandrinus, then we have Vaticanus. I believe that's the order in which they show up from oldest to newest. But germane to our study is that when you have a modern Bible translation such as KJV or NASB or ESV or whatever version you have, they pull from these manuscripts, and if there's a variant in the manuscript, that's going to cause your translator to use a different word when he translates it into English. So there's the a translation that pulls from a manuscript that reads Tes Basileia Su, and then there's the translation, let me go up earlier, that reads from a manuscript that says Tes Basileas Autu. And the difference that impacts us, let me scroll to the bottom of this particular tool. The impact is that NASB, using one of the older manuscripts, ends up with scepter of his kingdom, but KJV, using one of the newer transcripts, says scepter of your kingdom, or thy kingdom, the kingdom of his. The Tes Basileas Su is the thy kingdom, and the Tes Basileas Autu is the his kingdom, the kingdom of him. And I mentioned last week a little bit that this is kind of a minor difference, but in the end, we're going to find that it can have really a big significance, a big discussion and impact on whether or not the writer to the book of Hebrews is addressing the Son or whether he's addressing God. Because notice in the NASB it says, but of the Son he says, your throne, God, is forever. Sounds like he's talking to the Son. But then he says, the righteous scepter is the scepter of his kingdom. It sounds like it's talking to the Son, but the opponents might say that it's actually talking to God himself. Comparatively, when we look at the KJV, but of the Son, he says, thy throne, O God, is forever and ever. A scepter of righteousness is the scepter of thy kingdom. It sounds like we're still addressing the Son when we use two thys in the quote, thy throne and thy kingdom, is the point I'm trying to make. And the original Hebrew was your and your. So the original Hebrew doesn't have your and his, like the writer to the book of Hebrews pulls from the NASB. In other words, it doesn't use the word autu. The original Greek from the Septuagint, which we're going to definitely have to look at. In fact, let's do it right now. Find my Septuagint rendering. Apologize, my links changed over in the middle of the week. The Septuagint reference that I was used to referencing suddenly died. It disappeared. So I don't know what happened. The website went belly up or something. So I'm going to use a different tool. We have the Septuagint of Psalm 45:6, which is the rendering of the Greek translation into Hebrew, from the Hebrew translation into Greek in the 200 years before Yeshua showed up on the scene. And notice it says, Hathronas su, Hatheas eistan, Iona tu, Ionas chabdas, Euthu tetas, he chabdas tes basileas su. It doesn't say tes basileas autu. So this means the Septuagint rendering recognized that it was the kingdom of you, not the kingdom of him, which is kind of interesting. The original Hebrew had, we could say the kingdom of you, or your kingdom. So that seems to correspond. NASB here, we can see them side by side. Your throne, O God, is forever and ever. A scepter of uprightness is the scepter of your kingdom. Comparatively, KJV, thy throne, O God, is forever and ever. The scepter of thy kingdom, or the kingdom of you, the scepter of your kingdom, and the scepter of the kingdom of you. I keep swapping it back around for a reason there. So it sounds like a minor difference to most of us, but we're going to find later on that proponents to the Trinitarian view make a big deal out of this. So let's look at other what we might call non-Trinitarian versions real quick. We already looked at the REV Bible, where it talks about how that your throne is God forever and ever, right? This translation right there. This is a translation that was utilized by the Biblical Unitarian crowd. And then when they come to Hebrews chapter 1, verse 8, they once again have, but of the Son it says, your throne is God forever. So they remove what we call the vocative. Let's turn into another translation by the Jehovah's Witnesses, which we know are a non-Trinitarian outfit. In the book of Psalm, they translate verse 6 here as, oops, didn't mean to highlight that. They translate it as God is your throne forever and ever. Notice their translation is nearly identical to the Biblical Unitarian for good reason. They're going to opt for a translation that does not look like the vocative, because the vocative is the one that says, oh God. And if the writer to the book of Hebrews is addressing the Son, then it sounds too suspiciously like the writer to the book of Hebrews is saying that God is calling the Son God. But of the Son, he says, he the Father, oh God, right? Your kingdom, of God, is forever and ever, etc., etc. So the Jehovah's Witnesses are going to say, no, we don't believe Jesus is God. Therefore, we're going to opt for not the vocative, but the nominative. God is your throne forever and ever. What do they say about the book of Hebrews? Same thing. Let's bring up their translation for the book of Hebrews. Here we have it. But about the Son, he says, quote, God is your throne forever and ever, and the scepter of your kingdom is the scepter of uprightness. So again, they're removing what's known as the vocative. I'm not hanging all of my Trinitarian theology on the vocative, but I'm simply highlighting it for you, as I mentioned last week, because of the way that non-Trinitarian groups usually use that as their first point of attack. And just to be sure, notice they have the Jehovah's Witnesses have the interlinear version from the book of Hebrews. And when I scroll down to verse 8, but of the Son, or toward but the Son, pros de ton huion, the throne of you, ha thronosu, the throne of you, the God into the age of the age, and the staff of the right, straightness staff of the kingdom of him. They at least help us out by showing us that the autu is the of him, which tells me which manuscript they're pulling from. And also notice they simply say the throne of you, the throne of you. They don't tell us whether or not this is God's throne or the Son's throne, who receives his authority from God. They kind of leave it ambiguous, but just thought I'd show you what their interlinear translation. Let's jump to a non-Trinitarian translation from a Jewish perspective. Again, why am I highlighting the vocative versus the nominative? It's because when a non-Trinitarian interpreter encounters this passage in the book of Psalms or the book of Hebrews, if you're Christian, one of the first things they go for is opting for the non-vocative. Because if they say vocative, then they have to explain why the translation is, oh God. Why is the writer to the book of Psalms addressing the earthly king as God? Why? How can we make sense of the Elohim? Let's begin to look at the Hebrew perspective. Remember, the book of Psalms is translated by Jewish people, but they don't care about the book of Hebrews, so we don't have to look at that. There is no book of Hebrews from a rabbinic perspective. There's only the book of Psalms. And what do they say? Thy throne given of God is forever and ever. Kisach Elohim olam ve'ed. Thy throne given of God. Why didn't they say your throne, O God? Why? Because that's the vocative. It sounds too Trinitarian, sounds too Christian. Let's get rid of the vocative. Let's instead, and remember, the original Hebrew doesn't really have a vocative in this passage. We talked about that last week as well. Thy throne given of God is forever. So this is almost like a paraphrastic. They're inserting words that aren't really there. Given of God, the word given there isn't there. Thy throne given of God, Kisach Elohim, your throne, Elohim, literally the throne of you, Elohim. But they insert a verb, given of God, is forever and ever. Translating the Olam Ve'ed. A scepter of equity is the scepter of thy kingdom, Malchutecha, the kingdom of you, or your kingdom, the scepter of thy, which is the kingdom of you, your kingdom. So that's the JPS translation, the 100-year-old 1917 JPS translation. There is a modern version of the translation that shows up here. More of a modern. Is that it? Nope, that's not it. There is a more modern translation here. Let's look at Sepharia.org. They have of verse 7 here. You can see it in the middle of your screen. Your divine throne is, if I click on it, it'll do something strange to my screen, so I'm not going to click on it. But your divine throne is everlasting. Your royal scepter is a scepter of equity. So this is more of a modern JPS 1985. So they've cleaned up the language a little bit, right? They don't have the thys and thous and these and stuff anymore. But notice they also shy away from evocative sounding first clause. Your divine throne is everlasting. The word divine throne filling in for where it has the word Elohim, Kisacha Elohim. Notice also that when we're working our way through Judaic resources that are non-Christian leaning, that we also have to contend with other than JPS translations. Here's one from the Chabad.org outfit that translates right here. There we are, verse 7. Your throne, O judge, will exist forever and ever. The scepter of equity is the scepter of your kingdom. Again, non-vocative. Instead of saying your throne, O God, and instead of saying the throne that is given of you or the throne given of God or something else, they say, O judge. Now, why would they say, O judge? It's because the word Elohim in the Hebrew can be rendered as judge within context or magistrate. It doesn't always have to refer to God. We already know that judge, like Rashi, these are Rashi's comments here in the Tan section. Your throne, O judge, your throne, O prince and judge, shall exist forever and ever as the matter that is stated. Exodus 7:1, quote, I have made you a judge, Elohim, over Pharaoh, right? God speaking to Moses. And why? Because a scepter of equity is the scepter of your kingdom, that your judgments are true and you are fit to govern. So Rashi influencing this particular translation. I'm not saying Rashi made this translation that Chabad is using, but Rashi's comments, which are in the hand part there below the translation, explain that, well, the word Elohim doesn't even have to be God, whether it's God in heaven or God below, who the writer of the book of Hebrews might be referring to Jesus. It doesn't have to be either one of those. Elohim can simply be judge. So your throne, O judge, will exist forever and ever. Why would the throne of the judge exist forever? Because it's given of God, because it's the scepter of equity and the scepter of your kingdom. So there's another perspective that we have to deal with. Let's look at another fascinating perspective from the Targum. Now, what's the Targum? The Targum is the ancient Aramaic translation that was in use by the Jewish people who lived in the land of Israel, but had come so closely out of the exile from Babylon. Remember, we talked about this in Daniel's study. They came out of exile from Babylon and they had lost a lot of their Hebrew understanding as a mother tongue. So instead, Aramaic was the lingua franca, as it were, of the first century that was popularly spoke. And so when the Torah scrolls and the Tanakh were read in public settings in the first century, often they were read in Hebrew, but they were quickly followed up by an Aramaic paraphrased translation from the Hebrew into Aramaic, which is a sister tongue of Hebrew. It's similar to Hebrew, but it's not exactly the same. Some of the words change around. So the Targum has been preserved for us. There are several different Targums, about half a dozen different renderings from the Aramaic into what we might call from the Hebrew into Aramaic. And this is one of those Targums. I can't remember which one it is, but when we scroll down to Psalm chapter 45 and we start in verse 3, notice the Targumist starts by saying, your beauty, O King Messiah, is greater than the sons of men. The spirit of prophecy has been placed on your lips. Because of this, the Lord has blessed you forever. And then verse 4, 5, and 6, which are relevant to our study, and 7, gird your sword on high, O champion, speaking of this Messiah figure. Your glory and your brilliance is to kill kings as well as rulers. Verse 5, and your brilliance is great. Therefore, you will succeed in mounting the horse of the kingdom by reason of faithfulness and truth and humility and righteousness. And the Lord will teach you to do fearful things with your right hand. Verse 6, your arrows are drawn to kill Gentile hordes. Beneath you they will fall, and the sons of your bow will be released into the heart of the enemies of the king. Now look at verse 7. The throne of your glory, O Lord, lasts forever and ever. The scepter of your kingdom is an upright scepter. Because of you, verse 8, because you have loved righteousness and hated wickedness. Because of this, the Lord your God has anointed you with the oil of gladness more than your fellows. So in the Targum in verse 7, it says, the throne of your glory, O Lord, lasts forever. But notice, instead of making this psalm entirely about an earthly king like David or Solomon or someone else in the Davidic line of kings, like biblical Unitarian does, like much of rabbinic Judaism likes to purport, like the Jehovah's Witnesses like to talk about, instead of focusing our attention on the earthly king, notice when we jump back up to verse 3 that the Targumists say, your beauty, O King Messiah. Now, does this mean they're talking about Jesus? Nope, nope, and nope. They're not talking about Jesus here. But they are saying that this passage can be understood as being messianic. Now, we have to remind ourselves that in pre-Jesus Judaism, in other words, the Judaism that was earlier than the first century, Judaisms that preceded the first century, there was a lot of talk about messianic expectation, who would be the Messiah, who's going to hit the scene and be the Messiah, et cetera, et cetera. But that's why it's important for us to look at these other than Christian perspectives. And we'll see that if I can get this in time, if my time permits, we'll see that eventually we're going to read the commentaries from a Christian perspective that recognize that some great rabbinic sages speculated that this person being spoken of in this particular Psalm, chapter 45, is an earthly king, yes, but it points forward to a greater king, namely King Messiah. Now, again, does that mean they believe they were referring to Jesus? No, no, and no. But the reason this is important for our study is because it means that not all of the perspectives, at least from the National Israel side of the house, not all the perspectives were saying that this is just a mere earthly king. Because King Messiah he is an earthly king, but he's more than an earthly king. He's the consummate earthly king. He's the greatest earthly king that would eventually rule over Israel. So, in conclusion, as we're drawing our study to close, I realize I'm not going to finish this tonight because I've got more resources. Let me just at least show you from the technical perspective why I've been highlighting the vocative, what it means to say the rendering is vocative versus nominative. If we look at the use of Elohim in Psalm 45, verse 6, I've just pulled this chart from the internet. We have over on the left side of the chart, Elohim as vocative, meaning vocative means it's applying to the person, addressed to a specific person. The rendering would be your throne, O God, or your throne, God. We don't have to have the word O there and make it sound so archaic. We can simply say your throne, God, and it still is what we might render as vocative. That's the form of address, that particular case of noun or pronoun or adjective. So nouns, pronouns, and adjectives in Greek, as well as Latin and other languages, I think German as well. Hebrew doesn't have this particular distinction as carefully shown and demonstrated, but Greek does. So vocative noun or vocative pronoun or vocative adjective. Your throne, God, or your throne, or God. Remember, I humorously mentioned a few times that, if my wife were addressing me to tell me to go do my chores or whatever, then she would use the vocative, hey, Ariel, you need to go do this, do that. But if we have Elohim as predicate, then it would be your throne is God. Predicate is part of the sentence that doesn't indicate vocative. It's not the person being addressed. Subject, predicate, object, right? So predicate would be the object. Your throne is God. So here the word Elohim is the subject of the sentence, the object of the sentence, the subject being thrown there, kisacha in the Hebrew, and thronos in the Greek. Your throne is God. So this would be Elohim, the word for God in the English. The Hebrew would have it as a predicate here, predicate instead of the vocative. But if applying to God when we're talking about the use of Elohim as subject, we can swap that around. Instead of being the predicate, being the object, we can make it the subject. God is your throne. So notice, first we have your throne is God, and then we just reverse it. God is your throne. We still have the verb in the middle there, the is, but we just simply swap the two nouns around. Your throne is God, or God is your throne. So Elohim can either be predicate, meaning at the end of the sentence, or it can be at the beginning of the sentence as a subject. God is your throne. Elohim is your throne when we're talking about being applied to God. So these are just three different ways that we could look at the verse, and the Greek allows for all of those renderings, whether it's the vocative or just the simple nominative, nominative being the word for noun, nominative either in the predicate sense or nominative as the subject. Nominative, the noun, Elohim either being at the end of the sentence as the object, or being at the beginning of the sentence as the subject, as God. So either way, the Greek can go one of those ways, and the translators have to make their choice. And in closing, let me just show you again, in case you're confused by these terms, predicate and nominative and vocative. The predicate is the part of a sentence or clause that tells us what the subject does or is. So in this example, we got the exam was difficult. The subject is the exam. That's at the beginning of the sentence, the subject, like the word Elohim in our sentence earlier. And then we have the verb was between the two nouns. And then the final noun, or in this case, it's like an adjective, was difficult, the predicate. So we have subject at the beginning of the sentence and predicate at the ending of the sentence. So it's the part of the sentence that tells us what the subject does or is. In this case, the exam was or is difficult. Your throne is God, is the translator's option that he can use when he's looking at patronos, su, etc., etc. The second example, notice, we have the man from the shop knows my secret. Subject of the sentence, the subject clause, the man from the shop, and the predicate clause, indicating by the beginning verb, knows my secret. And so when we compare that to earlier, your throne, O God, in the vocative strips away the verb, just your throne, O God. But if we put it into a nominative, where we have the predicate at the ending, then your throne is God. We have to stick in a verb there. And that gives us the verbal clause there, the predicate clause at the very end is God. Otherwise, when we have the Elohim as the subject, when we're talking about God, we have God is your throne. Again, the verb is stuck there in the middle between the two nouns, God and throne. So just some different options. Another a way to look at the predicate noun, just to remind us, Mr. Smith is a doctor. Predicate noun. Notice this isn't vocative. This is the predicate understanding of the way sentences work. Mr. Smith being the subject at the very beginning of the sentence. The linking verb is the is stuck between the two nouns. And then the predicate noun at the very end is a doctor. At the beginning of the sentence and at the end of the sentence is a noun. We have Mr. Smith and we have doctor. They're both nouns, right? God and throne, like in our verse. They're both nouns, Elohim and thronos, or Elohim, theos and thronos in the Greek, or Elohim and kisa in the Hebrew. They're both nouns, but the difference between our translation is driven by, do we see this sentence as a nominative, or in other words, noun type sentence with a verb kind of stuck in the middle, or do we see it as a vocative, where your throne is God, your throne, O God, vocative. So this is just, again, another example of predicate. So here's what I'm going to do starting next week. I'm going to turn now, we've already looked at all of, as we're drawing our study to a closing, conclusion, and summary, we've already looked at all of the structural analysis. We've looked at somewhat exhaustively at every translation that is really relevant to the discussion. Christian translations, both Trinitarian and non-Trinitarian, and Jewish translations, obviously all non-Trinitarian. And we looked at Jehovah's Witnesses translations, right? We don't care to look at go any further than that, but just that gives us kind of an idea of what we're dealing with. We also looked at the possibilities between the different Greek manuscripts, right? The throne of you, the throne of him, et cetera, and how that impacts our understanding of the passage. And then we also looked at the Septuagint renderings. We looked at the Aramaic translation from the original Hebrew, going over into Aramaic. And we looked at differing ways in which the Christian translations can opt for either the vocative or the nominative. So that's what we call structural analysis. All of that is behind us now. That's all the kind of the technical stuff. In my final push for the Trinitarian perspective, starting next week, we'll look at, let me pull up this, we'll look at a commentary from a Trinitarian-leaning website by the name of CARM, right? It's a Christian Apologetics and Research Ministries. It's Trinitarian perspective. After that, we'll look at another perspective from a Trinitarian-leaning website, Key to the Trinity. And then, oops, I'm sorry, I skipped one. Let me back up. I apologize. There is actually a translation. Let me, you know what? Let me take a little bit of time and show you this one. I apologize. I should have shown you this earlier. My bookmarks got the better of me. Let me scroll up. Here we go. Look at this particular website. This is just a blog post from a non-Trinitarian perspective, and they highlight the idea that there's a very important manuscript variant reading of verse 8 from the book of Hebrews into Greek. Manuscript variant of the verse from Vaticanus and Sinaiticus, the two older. Remember I was struggling earlier. There's 3 significant manuscripts in view at any given time, 2 of which are the main and the one of which is a kind of a bit of a minor, but it's still there. There's, in this order, if I'm reading them right, there's Sinaiticus. Sinaiticus is indicated by the symbol aleph in the Hebrew. And then there's Vaticanus, which is, if I remember, is the letter B. And then there's Alexandrinus, which is the letter A. And I believe that is the order they go in. But anyway, the 2 older are the Vaticanus and Sinaiticus. This is represented by the NASB, which reads his kingdom instead of your kingdom. If this is the correct manuscript reading, it would mean that the writer was quoting a version of the Septuagint with this reading. So should it read your kingdom or his kingdom? Remember the very ending of the verse with his kingdom with autou versus your kingdom with su, right? So tes basileus autou or tes basileus su. Which one is it? This particular non-Trinitarian resource tells us that this is very significant since the throne in question in this verse is the throne of the kingdom, God's kingly throne. They continue. It appears that the best manuscript evidence may favor his kingdom, i.e. tes basileus autou, his kingdom, which grammatically can be taken to refer to the Father's kingdom, the kingdom of him, his kingdom, rather than the kingdom of you, your kingdom, the tes basileus su. You guys following along with me? In case you're not, let me just show you those 2 one more time. All right, so let me highlight both of these for you. In one rendering from a Greek manuscript, tes basileus su, the kingdom of you or your kingdom. And then below that, tes basileus autou, the kingdom of him, his kingdom. So notice if there are 2, here's why this other web resource is making this important for us. If there are 2 people in question, which all along that is kind of the case, right? Is it God's kingdom or is it the Messiah's kingdom? Is God being the one addressed when we say, oh God, or is it the Father who's, oh God, or is it the Son who's, oh God, right? Really, that's at stake here. And so this is important for us. If the writer to the book of Hebrews is using a manuscript which talks about the kingdom of you, and he just earlier said, but of the Son, your kingdom, then the kingdom of you is the Messiah's kingdom per se, right? The addressee, it would be Messiah, who the writer to the book of Hebrews just addressed as, O God, your throne, O God, the kingdom of you, tes basileus su. But according to the non-Trinitarian model, if the authority being spoken of is God's authority, and the kingdom being spoken of is God's kingdom, the kingdom of him, not the Messiah, but the kingdom of him in heaven, the Father, tes basileus autou, the kingdom of him, then the hathronos su, the kingdom, his kingdom is God. And so it changes your perspective of the hathronos su, your kingdom. Is your Messiah or is your God, the Father your? That's really what's at stake. So I hope you guys are understanding the important important distinction being made between these two. So now let's go back to this particular resource, non-Trinitarian, by the way. So they say if his kingdom is the correct reading, right, the older of the manuscripts is the his kingdom. Now, whether or not the older is the more correct, you would think by default that the older should be the correct, right? It's the one that came first, but sometimes it's the older simply by date, but it may represent already a copyist's change, an alteration in the text that happened very early, meaning the writer to the book of Hebrews may have really said your kingdom, but a copyist changed it to his kingdom, and by way of age, the oldest one that survived first is his kingdom instead of the your kingdom, right? Something like that effect. Hope you guys aren't confused. So if the his kingdom is the correct reading, then it's even more clear that the first instance of hotheos in verse 8 refers to God the Father, and the vocative translation, "O God," is not correct. So this is why it's important from this blog post perspective. This is just one of many of their arguments, but this is one of their final arguments, which I thought was worth bringing up because it does add part to the discussion. And if you're one of those who says, well, that's just the nail in the coffin, that really is the final word because it's the oldest of the translations. It says his kingdom, and his would be referring to God the Father, not Jesus, the human king, et cetera, et cetera. So that settles the matter for me. That's why we bring this to our into the discussion. And they talk about that this fact has also been acknowledged by Trinitarian academics. The pronoun his would be referring back to the Father in the phrase, the throne of you, hotheos, which means this phrase refers to the Father's kingly throne, which the risen Jesus sat down upon in order to rule God the Father's throne. So again, they show you this. But concerning the Son, your throne, hotheos, is the age of the age. The scepter of righteousness is scepter of his kingdom. Notice it says that second person, the throne of you, but third person, his kingdom. So that's where we get some oddities. The older of the translations is the switch from the second person to the third person. That's how it reads in the oldest of the Greek. The newer of the Greek renderings simply switch everything over into the second, the throne of you and the kingdom of you. That's why the translations out of the KJV read the way they do. Thy kingdom, or your the kingdom of you instead of the kingdom of him. That's why they do what they do there. But just be aware that the original Hebrew, which is actually the oldest, again, the oldest of the Hebrews that we have available to us, including the Septuagint, are you and you instead of you and his, something like that. But this web blog says that this strongly indicates that his does not refer to the Son, but to the Father. That being the case, the antecedent to his would be hotheos, the Father, the God of Jesus, the God of all. And so here's how they render it. In closing, we'll leave off here tonight. But concerning the Son, your throne, God the Father, is the age of the age. The scepter of righteousness is the scepter of his, God the Father's, kingdom. And that's why they make that particular distinction. And I'll leave off there. Next week, what I'll do is I'll finalize by showing you these last resources from a Trinitarian-leaning resources. We got Carm here. We have another resource, another blog, Truth and Tidings. We have, this is Tim Higgs' commentary on Hebrews chapter 8. Hebrews chapter 1, verse 8. And then lastly, we'll pull a commentary from Dr. Michael L. Brown, who is obviously a Trinitarian Messianic Jew. And then that will finish up all of our look at this particular verse. And I will finish this next week. But that'll do it for a Trinitarian response to biblical Unitarianism. Let's close in prayer. Abba, I bless your name. And what a fascinating study it is to embark upon, looking through all of the prophecies in the book of Daniel, how they pertain to our understanding of the book of Revelation, and the events that are likely to be unfolding very, very soon in our day and age. Thank you, Lord, for informing us in advance about what we can look forward to, not just in terms of the trouble that's around the corner. I mean, who's looking forward to trouble? But we're looking forward to the deliverance that you are going to grant us, that you're going to execute on our behalf, the punishment against wicked, the judgment against the evil world systems, and the ushering in of your righteous kingdom. And likewise, this particular apologetic study on Trinitarian matters, is Jesus very God, or is he simply a human being? Lord, we believe that you are very deity. You are very God veiled in flesh. You are the second person of the Trinity. You are fully God, truly God, and yet you are fully man. You are truly man. You are truly human. We can't understand how that paradox can come together, how this can be true. And yet, because of the language that the Bible has left for us, the authoritative word, even in its various different ways of translations and interpretations, nevertheless, your truth is not lost to the translator and not lost to the interpreter. It's not confused in all of the gobbledygook and all of the muddying up of different perspectives. Lord, I believe by faith that the Spirit reveals that if we simply allow the Word of God to speak for itself in its entirety and authoritatively speak into our lives, that we are left to wrestle with this mystery, this paradox, this tension created by the text, that the Messiah that we read about is truly human, and yet at the same time, he's truly God. And so I worship you as Son of God and Son of Man, even if I can't fully grasp it and articulate it. But thank you, Lord, for this time of counting the Omer from Pesach to Pentecost. Continue to help us to have the proper perspective as we go forward, looking with anticipation to the outpouring of the Holy Spirit and the giving of the Torah at Shavuot coming up very, very soon. And we'll be careful to give the praise and glory, B'Shem Yeshua, Amen.